Hello, Peter4700 here, Sirus. Welcome to my review for Dragon's Crown. Now, being a fan of Muramasa the Demon Blade, I have to say I was pretty interested in getting this game since both games are developed by vanlliaware and both games are, more or less, 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up / action RPGs. Albeit still different, just from seeing the footage, from how the 2D field in Dragon's Crown is a multi-plane field compared to Muramasa's singular plane field, how Dragon's Crown is a more loot-driven game, and etc. So suffice to say, I was pretty interested in this game when I heard it was coming out, even though it seems pretty different from Muramasa. Though I didn't really get to play it until like 2 months later after initial release, since I did want to play co-op with my brother at least once. But now that I did have a co-op experience with my brother, and have done a normal playthrough, hard playthrough, and infernal playthrough of the game, I would like to give my overall impression of the game. So without further ado, let's begin this review. Dragon's Crown is a side-scrolling beat-em-up / action RPG that was developed by vanlliaware and published by Atlus. It is available for the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation Vita.
She appears calm on the outside, but it is apparent to all that she carries the weight of the world on her shoulders. The Parliament is split between those who would want the princess on the throne and those who...
Visually, I say the game looks absolutely beautiful, with the character sprites looking pretty good and detailed. The enemy designs also look good for the most part, with the clear standout being the boss visual designs. The backdrop looks absolutely amazing, with the medieval Dungeons and Dragons setting, from orc fortresses to woodlands to ominous caves, ancient ruins, and the variety of locations you'll be going through is also pretty good for the most part. With there being 9 types of stages you're able to go through, but you're able to unlock a different route for each stage as you progress the game. The special effects that you see via the different amount of attacks you can do, or different type of skills or magic that you and the other party members in your party can use, whether they are controlled by player units or by computer AI, looks great overall. And the overall animation looks really amazing for the most part, from battle animations to the running and walking animation to the idle animations you get from just standing around. The animation looks great and there's tons of detail in the animations themselves. And overall, this game just looked absolutely beautiful on the PS3. Music wise, I say the soundtrack is pretty nice to listen to, though I probably say I didn't got quite as enamored with the soundtrack as I did in Muramasa Demon Blade. And voice acting wise, well, there's not much voice acting in Dragon's Crown, with me only really judging it on the narrator's voice. There are other voice clips in terms of different class dialogue, but those are fairly limited to battle grunts, a line of dialogue revolving around them joining you, or around the dinner area. But I have to say that I enjoyed the narrator voice acting, especially with how he's used in the game via like a dungeon master during a D&D game. Though he can be a bit annoying at times with how much the narrator keeps reminding you what to do in the main quest. But on a side note, I think you can change the narrator voice to your character class voice. But do note that there is a Japanese voice setting for Dragon's Crown in terms of the characters you'll be using. Heck, you can even customize the character's sprite a bit. Though having the characters speak in Japanese isn't all that much difference in my opinion. As I said before, their dialogue mostly consists of battle grunts and a few phrases. So take with that as you may. Story wise, well, the game gets you to play as an adventurer, which you can choose as one of 6 classes at the beginning, who joins a guild along with finding a partner named Ronnie, who doesn't really have any impact in the story whatsoever, where your job as a guild member basically gets you involved into the events of the royal family, having to save a wizard, and etc., which all pretty much leads you to save the land of Highland. The overall story is pretty forgettable. if I have to be honest, and pretty bare bones. And the characters are also pretty forgettable as well, with the characters not being all that interesting and never getting any sort of development in the story. Well, I guess the princess does get a bit of development, but you don't really interact with any of the characters all that much, so you don't really care for them in the end. But I will say that quite a few of the side stories you get from being the various side quests are semi-interesting, and the artwork you get from completing them looks great to look at. But speaking generally, having a forgettable story in this type of game isn't that big of an issue, if I have to be honest, since this game does seem to have more of a focus on the combat, questing, the loot RPG elements, and etc. Overall, in the presentation side of things, Dragon's Crown got great visuals with its sprite work, awesome animations, and the backdrop / environments looks gorgeous with its medieval Dungeons and Dragons setting. And I am impressed of how many enemy varieties in this game. Though the cons of the presentation Dragon's Crown is that it got a pretty forgettable story and characters. Albeit you can get a few interesting side stories from side quests.
In olden times, whenever a girl disappeared, the locals would say she'd been called to the castle of the dead.
Okay, now let's finally get to the meat of the game, which is to discuss the gameplay of Dragon's Crown. I first discuss how the game is structured, the combat system that the game employs, the RPG elements / looting nature of Dragon's Crown, along with other additional stuff such as how multiplayer plays out, how long it took me to complete the game, and etc. Now structurally, Dragon's Crown got a hub system where you got a town hub, and from there you're able to go to the various dungeons via either selecting them like a level select screen if you go to the stable area in the town hub, which does cost money, or by going to the gate area, which will randomly teleport you to a dungeon and cost nothing. But do know that if you do use the gate area and if you're online, I do find it that you're probably going to go to another person's game. Well, from my personal experience of using the gate area. But also know that during the beginning parts of the game, you don't have the stable area, so during the starting parts of the game, the gate area will function the same as the stable area basically. Okay, now you know how the general game works or plays out like in terms of structure. Let's talk more about what you actually do in the town hub. In the town hub, you'll basically be getting your items from Morgan or Cane shop, along with doing repair work. Well, you'll probably mostly be doing repair work in the shop since weapon durability is a thing in this game, and it's really used to introduce a risk and reward system in regards to going through multiple dungeons in basically one session. There's also the guild area, which is the place where you get your quests along with upgrading your skill tree, the stable and gate area as I mentioned before, as well as the tavern area, which is the area where you first choose which character you're going to use, along with choosing if you want any computer AI to join you in your, adventures. And then there's the temple area, which main function revolve around the various bones you find in a dungeon, which you can revive in order to get more allies, or bury in order to, free up more space. And then there's the prayer function, which is basically a function where you're able to get various bonuses, such as you having prayer to increase your score, increase your life points, and etc. But do note that you can only really have one type of prayer per quest or adventure. Oh yeah, there's also the castle area. The castle area doesn't really have any gameplay feature with it basically mainly being a place to progress the story. So I'm not really gonna talk much about it. Okay, now let's talk about how the individual stages / dungeons are structured. It's pretty simple in that you select the stage you want, progress through it along with defeating enemies, choose what kind of route you want to take. There are 2 routes for each level, then progress through the rest of the dungeons, defeating enemies along the way till you get to the boss and beat them. then you either get an option to go to another dungeon, with the risk being that the item you use won't replenish and your equipment is getting battered, thus the use of bags in this game, with the reward being money, chests, and score multipliers. Or you can basically end it right there, where you get a result screen which details the amount and quality of loot that you get, with you being able to praise your loot there or sell them. The dungeon design itself is fairly simple, with it being very similar to the arcadey 2D style beat 'em up, with you basically progressing forward as you defeat enemies to the boss, though there is a variety of optional rooms which you can get access to, which the room's purpose is mostly for side quests. You'll also be collecting treasure chests, which is your main way to getting loot along with defeating bosses, and that's basically the overall structure of the dungeons. Though I have to add, there are a couple moments in the dungeon design where you have to use the environment to effectively beat the stage, like using the cannon for the Goblin Gate boss, which I think is the highlight of the dungeon design of the game. All in all, I think the structure is fairly good. The town hall basically serving what I expect what a town should do in an RPG like this, like getting quests, getting items, getting allies, etc., with it being fairly easy to access each area by either walking toward them or by selecting them on the map screen, with the overall structure of the dungeon themselves being quite enjoyable. And I do like the occasional moment in the dungeon design where it's recommended that you use the environment to your advantage, though it is possible to beat it without using the environmental factors. Just that it takes a whole lot longer without using the environmental factors. The only con I can really say about the structure that it really takes quite a bit for the game to really get going. You don't even get online capabilities into it after the first few hours. Now to get to the combat system Dragon's Crown. Dragon's Crown plays out like arcade style 2D beat 'em up, with you playing one of 6 classes with each having their own unique arsenal of attacks, along with you being able to use items you get from equipping them beforehand or by picking them up in the dungeon, and you'll basically be using your arsenal attacks and items and just wailing on the different amount of enemies and bosses you encounter. And do note that this game has a party system, which means you can have up to 3 additional characters to join you in your quest. Though do note that the more players there are, the more HP boost the enemy have, and it's entirely possible to go entirely solo on the game. And along with combating enemies and bosses, you'll also be collecting loot via opening chests, and also be collecting small trinkets here and there to increase your overall score, which is basically your experience points. And this all takes place on a 2D multiplane field. Now that we talk about the general description of the game, let's go more in depth by talking about the 6 individual classes that you can play as, which are the Fighter, Dwarf, Amazon, Sorceress, Wizard, and Elf. The Fighter, Dwarf, and Amazon are your melee combatant type of characters, with the Fighter being your tankish character, the Dwarf being the grabber type of character, along with him being able to use specialty offensive items like bombs and barrels. And lastly, the Amazon is basically your berserker type of character, where she deals an absurd amount of damage, and the more she attacks an enemy, the more damage she does and the more quick her attack speed is. But she also has pretty weak defense for a melee character. But do note that those buffs that you get from attacking an enemy constantly will reset if you get damaged, or at least knocked down, I think. Each of the melee combatants got a variety of moves that ranges from their own unique moveset of standard ground and aerial attacks, defensive moves such as the Fighter and Amazon being able to block, though the Amazon is able to parry, with the Dwarf being able to buff himself to decrease the amount of damage he's taking, along with decreasing his chances of getting staggered, though he can't block. And lastly, each of the melee combatant characters have a power smash attack, which is a powerful attack which also grants them temporary invisibility, though at the cost of them losing their weapons temporarily. Oh, and yeah, every character class in Dragon's Crown is able to evade as well. And there's also one thing to note for the melee combatant type of characters. Just as you're able to lose your weapon if you use a power smash attack, you also have a chance to lose your weapon if you take too much damage. So do note that if you're going to play the fighter, Amazon, and dwarf. Though if you do lose your weapon in this fashion, I do think that you are able to pick up your weapon right away if you go to it in the field. In comparison to you losing your weapon during a power smash attack, where you have to wait for a few seconds before being able to pick up your weapon again. I say I think because I don't really lose my weapon in this fashion too much, so I can't really remember. Okay, the next bunch of classes that I'm gonna talk about is the sorcerers and wizard. The sorcerers and wizard are your obvious magic users, with most of their attack consisting of spells. Whether these spells come from the staffs they are using, which cost mana, which is the meter above the wizard and sorcerers, which you have to occasionally recharge, and do note that the staffs you equip will change what type of spells you can use, or the spells can come from tomes that you contain from the skill tree and just equipping them like items via the equipment menu. And speaking of tomes, I will probably touch on how different the sorcerer and wizard are, which is to mainly say that the wizard is your more offensive type of character, with the sorceress having a fair share of offensive spells and support spells, though her offensive spells isn't a match for the wizards. Both of the classes are also able to levitate if you get the skill for it, which is a pretty useful function. Also note that the wizard and sorceress does have probably one of the more unique evades in the game, with their evade being basically being able to teleport the character at a certain distance. Though this type of evade does cost mana, and if they don't have enough mana, they just do a small short evade. Though personally, I would probably say levitate is probably a more better defensive option than teleporting. Well, at least for the sorceress. Okay, the last class I'm going to talk about is the elf class. Now the elf class is a pretty different class of her own, since she is essentially a jack of all trade type of characters. She's also the class that I mainly played through when I was playing through Dragon's Crown. The elf is basically what you expect from an archer type of character, with most of her devastating attacks being her arrows, which overall does prompt you to be careful with your attacks, since unlike the sorcerers and wizard, the elf can't replenish her quiver at will and have to get additional arrows from either enemies or wooden boxes in the dungeon. But luckily, the game does give you a bonder amount of arrows as you progress through each dungeon. But along with her various arrows attack, she also have a few close quarter combat options with her kicks and dagger, which can also do a substantial amount of damage if you upgrade the backstab skill, and a magical attack called lore. And lore is basically a magical attack that changes depending on where the elf is standing. For example, normally lore is a whirlwind attack, though if you stand near a torch, it would change into a fireball attack, or if you're near shallow waters, it would change into this water attack. Though if you're in deep water, it'll change into a whirlpool, and etc. Add this, and with how the elf is probably one of the more mobile characters in the game, and her ability to stay in the air the longest, the combination of evading in the air and charge shots, the elf is probably one of the most versatile characters in the game. Well, at least I think so. Though this might be a bit biased, with me mainly being an elf player, so yeah. Though I do find it ironic that I probably had the most trouble with flying units with the elf. Okay, now that I've explained how the game plays out and how each character plays out, let's talk about the other details of combat, namely the item management system, room system, and the food system via food you find in the dungeon itself and consume, and the cooking minigame. Now, item management is fairly easy to understand, as you really only need to equip the item you want to use, along with your armor, weapons, and accessory in the equipment menu, and when you're in the dungeon itself, you just scroll through the items you got equipped via the D-pad to select the item you want to use, and use it via pressing down the control pad. You can also hotkey items, which makes it pretty easy to use which items you want on the go. and is much more efficient than manually scrolling through. The rune system is basically a system that allows you to gain additional positive effects temporarily by clicking via cursor on the runes you see in the dungeon layout itself and combining it with the runes you have in your inventory. And also note that you might have to use some runes in order to progress the dungeon, but it really only requires the basic rune which you get at the start, and you don't really need to buy additional runes through the game. Now for the food system, I say it's a pretty interesting system in that food have quite a unique feature in Dragon's Crown. Most notably that by eating food, whether you get from picking them up in the dungeon or by the cooking minigame, you can raise your HP value over the maximum if you're eating food at full health. Though do note that you can't recover extra HP that you get from eating. Now with that said, I probably just go over briefly the difference between food you can get in the dungeon and the cooking minigame. The cooking minigame is basically a minigame that you can play if you're going through multiple dungeons, and it does have a chance to, along with increasing your HP, increasing your stats as well, as compared to food in the dungeon being only able to increase your HP. Overall, I say the combat is pretty addicting in Dragon's Crown, with the 2D beat 'em up style being pretty fun to play, with how fun and varied each of the character class is, there being a good amount of enemy variety in the game, the dungeon design being pretty well designed, albeit simple, with the stages being the right length for a 2D beat 'em up, and just how fun the bosses are in Dragon's Crown, with one of the bosses being an outright honorable mention to Monty Python the Holy Grail. Heck, there are tons of references to D&D in Dragon's Crown, which I think really works to its advantage for people who are able to catch said references. Though with that said, I do have a few problems to the combat in Dragon's Crown. The first problem is that the AI companion that you can employ is, well, they're not all that bright if I have to be honest. They're okay for the first playthrough, but it's really the second and third playthrough, which is to say on the hard and infernal difficulty, is where the game gets more tough and it's apparent that the AI is not all that smart, especially with them running into all of the traps. So it might be more prudent for you to either go online or local co-op or just go solo all the way. Especially with the fact how enemy HP values go up with more players you have in your party. The second problem is how rune is handled, more due to the fact how clunky the cursor is, especially with the rune effects revolving around dealing status effects on enemies like Petrify or Purify Dead, which overall make them kind of useless with how clunky the controls for the cursor is. Now lastly, I'll talk about RPG elements and customization. Dragon's Crown has a relatively simple leveling system, with you just leveling up your characters where they get stats up when you get enough experience you gain from either completing dungeons or side quests. Along with leveling up, you also get SP, which is to advance the rather extensive skill tree that each class have, with each class having two kinds of skill trees. One that is unique to that class that will amplify the class unique playstyle, such as the elf getting points in clone shot will allow her to fire more arrows when she does an upward charge shot on the ground or running shot, or the dwarf adding shockwaves to the throws he's done, and etc. And another skill tree that is universal to every class, which amplifies what each class can, well, universally do, like being able to do more voids, putting points in deep pockets to increase the amount of stuff you can equip, and etc. Equipment customization is rather simple as well, with you basically equipping various done armor and weapons along with items, but there is a lot of it with the amount of loot you get. Overall, I say the RPG elements and customization are rather good, with the skill tree providing you with a good feeling progression and good customization overall, and there being lots of loot to go through, which does make it feel really satisfying to go through dungeons for. Lengthwise, it took me about 15 hours to complete the game on the normal difficulty. And speaking of difficulty, the game increases the difficulty of subsequent playthroughs, with it unlocking hard by completing the game on normal, and unlocking infernal by completing hard. though the increased difficulty really only increases the level of each character and raises the level cap of your characters. Oh yeah, there are level caps in this game, with normal capping you at 35, hard at 65, and 99 at infernal. The game also got a decent amount of side quests, with there being like 50 side quests, and the side quest feels pretty rewarding to do, with you getting additional SP for doing them, along with experience and getting additional artwork. Though I would probably say there's not enough side quests for an infernal run of the game, which I find kinda disappointing. Though there is an optional dungeon after you beat the game once called Labyrinth of Chaos, so I think that makes up for the lack of side quests during an infernal run. Well, a bit. Okay, now let's briefly talk about the multiplayer in this game. I say it's a lot of fun. For me personally, local co-op was a lot of fun with my brother, with the multiplayer having this quick drop-in style, a bit like how the 2D beat-em up arcade works, which I really think works to its favor. But do know that in local co-op, you might have to wait for it in the town hub if you get new equipment, since you have to manually wait for each player to organize their equipment, especially waiting for each player to go into Morgan's shop, repair their equipment, go out, and wait for the next player to do the same thing. But still, regardless of this, local co-op is still a lot of fun. Overall, I say Dragon's Crown got a really addicting gameplay, with the 2D beat-em up combat, the classes being unique and fun to play through, the structure of the game being pretty well designed, the progression system via skill and getting loot being pretty good, and the bosses overall just being a blast to fight through, with the cons of the game being probably a few things, like Dragon's Crown having a relatively slow start, the cursor being a bit clunky and slow to use, and I probably do find the rune system to be kind of a useless function in the game. Overall, I say Dragon's Crown is a really enjoyable and well-made game. The game is beautiful to look at with the 2D sprite work and beautiful backdrops, the animations being top-notch, the 2D beat 'em up style being addicting, with it having 6 character classes that are varied and are fun to play through, it having a decent amount of content, and the bosses being generally enjoyable. The cons of the game is probably the uninspiring story and characters, the cursor being pretty clunky to use, how the game have a relatively slow start, etc. But I would still say I would recommend the game wholly if you're looking for a beautiful game to sink your teeth in, with it also having a generally enjoyable 2D beat 'em up style combat.